Hello, and welcome to this edition of the Beyond Waste podcast from CIWM. I'm Lee Marshall, and I'm your host, and I'm the Director of Innovation and Technical Services here at CIWM. Now, today's episode is all about financial policies. Unfortunately, CIWM published a report on this at the end of last year. So I'm delighted to say one of my guests to help me out is Susan Evans, who is one of the authors of that report. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Lee.
Good to have you on board. And just to make sure it's not a total CIWM love-in, as it were, we've got someone from outside, but will be well known to everyone. So we're delighted to say we've got Paula Chin from WWF.
Hi, Lee. That's quite an intro. And hi, Susan, as well.
Yeah, delighted to have you both on board. So I'm sure people, or at least some of the listeners, will have seen this report, but perhaps for those who haven't, Susan, if we start maybe by giving them a little bit of a summary of what the report was about and maybe one or two of the things in there before we sort of get into some of the conversation around financial policies and how they relate to sort of circular economy in the resources and waste sector.
Yeah, definitely. So this report came about, I think, because there's quite a few policies happening simultaneously with sort of different staggered timelines and that affect different parts of the waste sector and other people within the value chain of resources and waste. So from producers through councils and individuals through to the waste managers. And the idea was that we would review what's happening kind of in the round, look at what the intended impacts of the different policies were and what the potential unintended consequences are as well, and do some thinking about how they kind of all work together, draw out themes around how they could potentially be improved to achieve the outcomes. And the outcomes that we were really focusing on for those policies were decarbonising the waste sector and improving and increasing recycling, and then of course bring about the wider circular economy with reduction and reuse and circular business, those kinds of things. So we looked at the sort of fairly predictable policies that you might consider under those topics. So decarbonising the waste sector's landfill tax, emissions trading scheme. Under recycling policy, there's extended producer responsibility, EPR, deposit return scheme, DRS, lots of acronyms obviously in this podcast, plastic packaging tax, PPT, but let's avoid using PPT because no one uses that much. And then for the broader circular economy, there's the single-use item charges on various single-use and especially plastic items. And then the more positive incentives, including subsidies for circular business and reuse. So that's kind of overview of what we were looking at.
Cool. And is there any sort of high-level themes, findings that came out initially? And I know they're all slightly different things, and they're trying to do different aspects. But anything you thought, actually, as a result of looking at all these, there's one or two common threads we can start to sort of see emerging.
Yep, there definitely were. So I'd say one thing that definitely comes out, I think, across all of the policy areas is that you need a sort of package of incentives that works well together. So that might include some positive incentives, some negative ones. It might include incentives addressing different parts of a value chain for a particular type of material or product. And it might include other rules that aren't fiscal or financial incentives, but broader kind of regulatory bits and pieces that are needed to kind of avoid things going wrong in practice. So that's kind of one thing, the sort of package of incentives. There's definitely also a need for more nuance in some of these incentives. There's always that sort of debate, should you go for something that's like very high level and simple and it's easy to implement and grasp, like the plastic packaging tax, I suppose, is an example of that. Just like one sort of lever and then just see what happens. But actually, in a lot of cases, you do really need to get into the details because if you keep it too simple and high level, then you can just, for example, around EPR rules, you need to think about how to incentivize reuse. You need to think about how to incentivize higher quality recycling. But actually, at the moment, what often happens is it just incentivizes recycling and then reuse is sort of rolled into the heading of recycling and reuse. So you don't really get that kind of ongoing improvement within the waste hierarchy that you might want. I say that I personally think that there could be some more positive incentives as well. So that's another theme. And then the other one was around, there's only a limited amount of money to go into positive incentives, and there's only a limited amount of political capital that governments can expend on doing negative incentives, because people don't tend to like them very much. So then you've got to think really hard about where you put those incentives. So there's always an opportunity cost, and it perhaps doesn't get discussed enough in policy making, that, you know, if you're putting all this effort and money into this policy, you're not doing something else. And all too often we're looking down at the bottom of the waste hierarchy at the end of the pipe, and we're not actually focusing that effort further up before the waste is created in the first place. So that kind of question of the opportunity cost of doing one thing rather than another definitely needs to come up in these types of policies, but probably also in all types of policies.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, we'll start to unpick a few bits of that as we go through the podcast. But I mean, Paula, coming across to you, how does that sound initially, and some of the work you've been doing, WWF have done in the past in terms of fiscal instruments? How does that fit with the sort of the view that you yourselves have got on that side of things?
Yeah, thank you, Lee, and thanks for inviting me to talk about this. Interestingly, CIWM's report came out just after a paper which I also chair, the Wildlife and Countryside Link Coalition's Circular Economy Working Group, and we also put together a fiscal incentives paper for circular economy. So clearly everybody's heads are thinking about the economic growth opportunity, which is obviously the government's circular economy strategy is putting the economic growth opportunity from enabling circular economy front and centre of the strategy. Yeah. What I like about the CIWM paper and the work that Susan and the team have done is the different ways you've looked at it, and obviously you've taken the approach about decarbonising the sector, and that's a key aim of the circular economy strategy. One area where Wildlife and Countryside Link is also trying to focus in on is circular economy to enable nature recovery, because we think that's missing from the terms of reference from the circular economy strategy. But in terms of the paper that we wrote, there were three key areas, and this links in with Susan already outlining the fact that you've got to engage all the different stakeholders in the value chain, and it's got to be a suite of policies, I think is a nice term, a suite of policies that's going to tackle behaviour shifts across each part of the value chain. We saw that with the government's 4 packaging reform policies that are now sort of into implementation phase, the plastics tax, EPR, DRS, and harmonising household recycling, curbside recycling collections. So that's the approach that we took with our paper as well. So thinking about, what's going to be a really effective lever to get producers to come to the table and shift their behaviour, what is the sort of economic growth opportunity that can be leveraged from the circular economy, and then also not forgetting the consumer and what are the incentives that can shift their behaviour. But just to touch on the bit about getting producers to try and shift, and we really see that extended producer responsibility as a policy measure is one that can be leaned on much more heavily than it already has been leaned on. Okay. One interesting aspect of the Circular Economy Task Force work that's going on at the moment is they have announced what their priority sectors are for developing roadmaps. And I have joined one of the working groups so far, a call they've had where they've laid out the proposals they see, and it's in the agri-food sector actually. Right. So if we think about agri-food, one area that absolutely needs to be tackled is food waste, but other opportunities around nutrient circularity in agriculture. But actually EPR has been mentioned as a possible lever to explore within that area, which might actually make people, you raise your eyebrows.
Yeah.
Because we think of EPR, really, it's most mature in the UK around packaging. It's snail's pace development for other resource and waste intensive sectors like textiles and electrical. So part of our paper is calling for, let's go faster and further with the ambition on EPR for those other sectors, learning from the hiccups and the challenges in developing packaging EPR. But to see that EPR is being thought about at the Circular Economy Task Force level as a possible policy measure to tackle other sectors where we wouldn't even think to apply it, I think is really interesting. So I think that demonstrates that it's got some legs. In terms of financing a circular economy, as I said, the government's really seeing circular economy as a growth opportunity, and that's the number one priority for the current government. But financing the circular economy, some stats around how the number of public market funds with a circular economy focus has been growing. So I've got a stat here where it's in 2018, there was one public market fund with circular economy focus. And okay, it's slow progress, but by 2020, there were 10.
Okay.
But
progress.
in the private market fund sector, circular economy focus increased tenfold actually from 2016 to 2020. So, if we get financial institutions interested and seeing the opportunity in circular economy and it ties in with their own ESG goals, it's a win-win in many ways. So I think we've got to think really cleverly, and WWF has worked for a number of years with financial institutions to really get them on board with putting in robust sort of transition plans around net zero. If we can get them thinking about that, and circular economy makes can deliver a lot towards net zero and reducing emissions, as well as mitigating impacts on nature from virgin resource consumption, then there's a lot of different factors that could line up to make it very attractive investment area for financial institutions. But there's also non-financial incentives. So, for instance, if you hear and see so many businesses that are trying to start up that have circular ambitions in mind for their business model. So, obviously, affordable funding access for these sorts of businesses, it would be fantastic, but also non-financial incentives. So things like upskilling and training programs for circular economy behaviours like repair and refurbishment of electronic items, availability and access to solid, sound, robust advice and guidance as to how to set up a business to be more circular, the kind of communication messaging that you might want to engage your potential clients with, customers with. And then there are organisations like the British Standards Institute who are also leaning into this space. I was involved as a stakeholder advisory member for a development of a publicly available standard to talk about circular, how small and medium-sized enterprises can build in more circular thinking when they are designing their products, especially, and the paper's particularly focused on electronic and electrical products. So there's a plethora of resources out there that don't have to involve exchanges of money that would be really helpful for growing the circular economy. And then in relation to consumer behaviour, there's obviously that combination of carrots and sticks, which that Susan's already alluded to. There's outright kind of charges that consumers have to pay on items that are less than circular. But there's also incentives and reductions. I think the humble coffee cup is an example where, the latte levy's been touted for a long, long time. It hasn't happened, but coffee retailers, including small independents, continue to incentivise their customers to bring their own coffee cups by giving, a 20, 30, 40p reduction. So
exactly, make it cheaper,
yeah, there's a whole mix of things. But tying it all together with the strategy, I think, is going to be, it's a massive opportunity, but comes with lots of challenges because it's such a disparate area.
Yeah, good. Go on, Susan. You were going to jump in there.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Paula. It's really interesting, and I think that sort of illustrates some of the high level points I was making there. So thanks. And I think I was going to come in on the point about the money and finance for circular businesses. And I do think that's a really important area, and it's great to hear that things are moving in the right direction, in the private sector. So my company, Resource Futures, has been involved in the past in delivering that kind of SME business support for circular business transitions, or for sort of very small businesses, sometimes also just trying to get going. And that used to be funded through channels like EU circular economy business support in Scotland, and I know that down in London, I think London's been involved in doing something similar. Okay. It's been a little bit patchy across the UK where there has and hasn't been this sort of subsidy for these businesses. But since Brexit, obviously some of that money has dried up, so it's an area that's quite of interest in terms of where are those smaller businesses going to get that help, maybe smaller businesses that are struggling to get interest from financial investors. I was involved in running a few workshops last year funded by Scottish Enterprise for circular entrepreneurs and startups, and that was the kind of in-kind support you're talking about, Paula. In part, it was sort of helping with that kind of advice on all the sort of considerations, getting your business model and testing it out and understanding your market. And there was huge appetite actually, and it was brilliant. It was these workshops were really sort of buzzing with energy, and it was interesting because there were startups and entrepreneurs from quite a diverse array of different types of businesses and sectors and materials, but they really enjoyed coming together and bouncing ideas off each other. And I could tell, well, they said that there was a real appetite for more support of that kind, whether it's that kind of technical business support, whether it's networking opportunities and all this kind of thing. And it would be great to see a bit more support, I guess, in different parts of the UK for that kind of thing on a more ongoing basis, rather than just sort of one-off things people come along to and then it sort of drops off again. And I kind of compare that to, if you look at the net zero picture, where, I guess in terms of policy and regulation and targets, things are a little more advanced and prioritised at government level. Obviously, it's an important area. So you have things like the, DESNZ with its business models, which essentially kind of larger size subsidies for industrial decarbonisation, and that's now going to be coming into the waste sector, with carbon capture and storage being subsidised, for energy from waste plants, and that's something that I feel like it's a bit of a shame that it's not replicated in the circular economy world a bit more explicitly, because circular economy is a really important aspect of reaching net zero, as we all know in this sector. And I feel like sometimes there's just sort of small bits and pieces here and there for circular economy, but there's something a little bit bigger and more systematic being done on wider net zero. So perhaps sort of rebalancing that a bit to recognizing the massive contribution that resources and material use make to overall carbon emissions. I think that could be a positive thing to happen in the future, hopefully.
I love the fact you both dive straight into the positive aspects of this, because it's so easy to get caught up in, it's financial policy, it's fiscal policy, it's tax, tariffs, very, apt at the moment. And yeah, there is some of that. Obviously, we've got the landfill tax, we've got the plastics packaging tax, it's in there. And, the producers would have you believe EPR is a tax. Shocker, it's not. It's transfer of cost. But let's not go down that rabbit hole and have that argument today. But it's so much more than that. It's like you say, it's the positive side of, and I love the phrase that you use about, we've got positive incentives and we've got negative incentives. On the one hand, I've got visions of Sir Humphrey going, well, Prime Minister, we have two sorts of incentives. But actually, it is the right phrase, though, isn't it? Because it is an incentive, like carrot and stick. So the stick is an incentive in its own sort of way. But like you said, there's lots of good examples of positive ones out there. But you've touched on it a little bit about the circular economy, and also, we've got lack of funding now. So how do we get these positive incentives in there? Where do we look to get the funding from to put these sorts of subsidies, funding, etc., in place? Where are we going to get it from? Because they've got real value, haven't they?
One obvious answer would be there's going to be money coming from EPR.
Yeah.
And that massive question around what's going to happen to that money, which, I've been to a fair few sort of events involving people from local authorities in the waste sector recently, and plastic packaging producers as well. Like, everyone is very, very worried that this money is just going to disappear into the local authority, fiscal black hole, which sadly exists at the moment. And this is, I think, coming back to what Paula was saying about having a sort of suite of policies that works. Like, it seems to me absolutely essential that we have the right suite in place to channel that EPR money to where it's meant to go, so that the waste teams sitting there in the local authorities with all their good ideas of things they want to do can actually do that. And, rather than just wondering where it's gone. And that's going to be really important from the perspective of the packaging producers as well, who are going to be paying an awful lot more into the system, and they're going to be asking questions presumably about how is this money being spent. They're responsible for meeting these targets of higher recycling over time for their packaging, and if it's not happening because the local authority waste teams just aren't being given access to that money to improve recycling services, then it's going to be a bit of a disaster all around. And then that whole point that Paula was saying around, it would be great to have more EPR schemes for more materials. Well, let's make sure that we figure out how to make it work right, I would argue, before charging into other areas as well. I do agree that we do want it in more areas, but we want it in a way that works. So I think the sort of things that could help there would be, if you look at the example of Wales and how they increased their recycling rates over time, it's a really great example of where they had the carrots and the sticks. The sticks were there. There was the threat of fines on local authorities if they didn't meet their recycling targets. Of course, in this case, we're talking about actual, local authority targets rather than producer targets, but the research that we did for our report found that the sticks actually weren't as important as all that. They weren't used that much, the fines. Generally, they were just there in the background as a bit of a threat. But what really helped was the financial help. So there was more money going into improving services, improving infrastructure to enable those targets to be hit. And there was also the blueprint. So as well as having the target, you've kind of got those service standard expectations of like, this is what should be happening, unless you've got a good reason for it not to. And I think there's kind of, you could see an equivalent there where you've got in Scotland, for example, they're looking at their statutory code of practice, and that could potentially work quite well together with the new EPR policies. So that if the local authorities, at least if they have statutory things they're supposed to be doing, then they maybe have a stronger business case to keep that money that's coming to them through EPR. And simpler recycling could do a similar job down in England. So that's just sort of one example of how we need to like find what do we need to. I'm sort of imagining like when you go bowling and you kind of, if you're rubbish at bowling like me and you need to have those things on the sides to stop the ball going down the side. We've got to get those up for this policy and like channel that money so it actually goes where it's supposed to.
And I think actually that is a really good example of a suite of policies, and a lot of people sort of outside of Wales focusing on the statutory recycling targets. But as you say, that was only one aspect of it, and I know I was at a council there doing it, but there was a lot of money went in. A lot of money went in from Welsh government, and people need to recognise the local authorities themselves needed to put in a lot of money to develop the services. But if they didn't, they had increasing landfill tax and the threat of those fines that would have cost them even more. So like you say, it was the threat of being hit by the stick metaphorically rather than actually being hit by the stick. Because if you get hit by the stick, you've sort of failed. It's missed the point.
Well, then it makes it harder to actually provide those good services as well. So that can be
so I think
a bit counterproductive.
A good example of a suite of policies. I mean, and then just to pick up on one little thing, on the EPR, I think you're right. We do need to see some reward for it. Equally, I think there needs to be, and I hope there's a realisation from everyone that some of that EPR money going in is a transfer of costs, and not all of it is there to develop the service. Some of this is about I wouldn't go as far as saying righting a wrong, but it is moving the cost from the public purse to the private purse. So some of it will pay for existing services, but yeah, we need some of it then to pay for better services and improved services going forward as well, don't we?
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point, Lee, from where you're sitting, because I think that is a point that is missed in the whole argument, is that producers have not been covering the cost of dealing with end of life, packaging for since PRNs were put in 1986, 1987. So it's almost like they're lucky there hasn't been a what do you call it when you back charge?
Oh yeah.
Could you imagine if government had said, local authorities had said, actually, we're now going to back charge you, so on top of your new EPR obligation, you owe us X hundreds of millions.
We're going to charge you interest.
That's a sort of cruel thing that I would put forward to scare them. But it's so right, and it's one thing as environmental NGOs that we have a responsibility to point out to producers all the time when they start, frankly, coming forward with their excuses and their tactics to try and delay or derail. We say the cost of the externalities of the impacts of not having the best system that we can probably have, or having a completely underfunded system that still functions to an acceptable level, because let's face it has. Curbside collections happen every week, maybe not in Birmingham at the moment, but let's not go there. But, sorry, very topical. But the externalities, we haven't even put a number on the cost of the impact on nature that the resources or the waste leaking into nature is having, most notably plastic, of course. But coming back to your point about, enabling better financial or attracting more financial investment into a circular economy, I think one thing that is absolutely needed for these financial institutions is policy certainty. And there has been policy uncertainty. I mean, these policies have been under development. So again, we're talking about the suite, the EPR, the DRS, the simpler recycling. They've been under development for 5-6 years now, and talked about before. And there's been so many twists and turns, DRS being a case in point, the situation with Scotland, the delays in the UK. So that policy uncertainty makes stakeholders, and not least will make investors very, very nervous. We can see it now on the global economic situation where there's the uncertainty around, tariffs. Everyone's like doing nothing and going, right, I'm just going to sit and wait and see what happens here. So we've had that. I mean, it's not an example that I particularly want to highlight, because as environmental NGOs, we are supportive of really scaling up of this technology. But the fact that the government or Treasury now, as part of the plastic packaging tax, has said that chemically recycled or advanced recycled plastics can be counted towards the 30% recycled content for the plastic packaging tax. Now, this isn't the podcast to go on about how I feel about that particular policy, but it is an example that has given policy certainty. So now those organisations and those investors into that sector say, actually, if we make it work and we grow it, there's policy certainty that it's going to count towards, and it's going to be meaningful for businesses to buy, or engage with advanced recycling technologies, because there's a fiscal benefit for them, because then they can get a reduction or an exemption from the plastic packaging tax. So I wish I could think of an example which, I really could get behind. But, look, I'm going to be balanced about it and say, I don't like it that Treasury have come out and given that policy certainty, but it's policy certainty.
Exactly.
And that's what happened with landfill tax as well. And that was done in a nice way, in the way that it was sort of increased incrementally over time, so it wasn't one big shock all at once. And that's always cited by people as an example of quite a well implemented policy that people were given that time to respond to. They were given that long-term certainty, and that's happened
And
quite effectively.
And on the plastic packaging tax side, I suppose they've also helped a little bit by saying actually your pre-consumer stuff isn't going to be able to count as well. So again, that helps swing it back. Now that all right, there may be unintended consequences and stuff, but I think both of those are actually good examples of how these policies evolve and can evolve. So actually, right now we've started to learn a little bit. We can adjust them. So it's not a case of you put this policy in on day one and you just walk away and leave
Absolutely. And I mean, the government's goals change over time.
Yeah.
Like, we were recently looking at a review of the Scottish landfill tax. And, if you look at the history of it, when it was brought in, or when the original sort of UK-wide landfill tax was brought in, the goals for the waste sector were a little bit simpler than they are now. It was mostly get things out of landfill was the main thing, and let's recycle more. But then over time, obviously the emphasis on carbon has come up a lot more. That's got to be taken into account. So the policy goals are evolving. Like circular economy, wasn't really a well-known term at all in the first decade of the 2000s, and now it's it's everywhere, which is great. But I think the kind of and the range of circular economy policies that people are talking about, the kind of technologies and techniques that are possible now are all a lot of them are relatively new. So then policy just has to keep evolving over time. So it's getting that balance, isn't it, between we want that kind of certainty, but we don't want to be too stuck in our ways either, and we need to be able to adjust things over time. And that's the sort of honest and realistic way of doing policy, like putting in reviews and sort of deciding how it needs to be adjusted over time.
I think we need to be cautious, though, around the socialisation of the term circular economy, because it has been discussed that actually outside of circles such as these, no one really knows what it means. And I've got an example of that from this morning, and it's going to sound really first world, so I do apologise. But I love playing tennis, but my tennis coach, who's a lovely chap, he goes through thousands and thousands of tennis balls a year. And so the tennis centre where he also works, the local tennis centre, they do have a box where you can take back your old tennis balls, and they take them for recycling. And a well-known tennis brand does sell tennis balls that are made from recycled materials. So it's great. So I was really encouraging him to buy these tennis balls, and he did for a while. I don't know, he's stopped now, but anyway. But I was talking to him about it this morning and saying that I was coming to record this podcast, and he was like, oh, what's it about? And so I sort of gave I was like, fiscal incentives for a circular economy, and he was like, do you know what? He was like, do you know what I heard? He went, okay, fair enough. So I tried to explain it simply, and I said, look, you go through thousands of tennis balls a year. What do you do with them at the end? Yes, I know you're probably good and you take them for recycling, but you probably throw a lot of them in the bin. I said, what if each tennis ball, a pack of 100 tennis balls cost £50, but actually you paid an extra £5 on top of that. And then when you returned your tennis balls for recycling, you'd get that £5 back. And he was like, oh, yeah, that sounds reasonable. And I was like, well, that is circular economy. Yeah. It's incentivizing different behavior. So, sometimes having tennis coaches to talk these things through, it kind of humbles you a little bit, because you can get lost in your own kind of circular economy showbiz when you have fantastic conversations with really knowledgeable colleagues like yourself, and then your tennis coach goes, I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's the reality. It's the reality check we all need, and I'm a bit like that. I listened to another podcast a while ago on. It was a sports podcast, but it was about textiles and textile fashion in sports, and how fast fashion sports kit is. And I'm sat there listening to it. On the one hand, I was thinking, oh, yeah, this is really bad. This needs sorting out. And the other hand, I'm thinking, that's me. I love stash. So you do, even sometimes you get yourself caught up in going, I am actually still part of the problem in some instances in my life.
Hugely. I think what's interesting though, and not that I want to get political about this all, but with all the I don't even know what you want to call it, all the uncertainty coming from across the pond, I know it's horrendous, and people's everyday lives are being impacted. The aid cuts and everything. So I'm not trying to minimise the impact of, for want of a better word, it's like uncertainty and chaos that's coming from across the pond. But in my quieter moments to myself, I'm thinking, actually, do you know what? It's not going to be so bad if there's not so much cheap stuff being shipped around the world and people endlessly buying, ever more things that they've already got 10 of in their cupboard because they are more expensive. I'm not condoning, I don't suggest that slapping tariffs on your biggest trading partners is the way forward. But it's interesting, so actually the inadvertently, the problem that could actually be solved by what's going on geopolitically and economically is not the problem that the tariffs are intending to solve, but it could actually be an interesting side benefit.
Yeah, and that I think also highlights though the need to kind of link up the fiscal and financial policies across sectors, right? Because on my so-called non-working day on a Wednesday, I go down to the Citizens Advice Bureau, and so social policy, is quite at the forefront of my thinking on that day. So the affordability of items is a massive problem, and thinking about how you design social policy to make sure that when we do tackle environmental policy, which often involves, trying to bring those costs of environmental pollution and everything into the cost of materials, which kind of needs to be done. But we also have policies that support people who are at the lower earnings end of the spectrum. It needs to all be joined up or it just doesn't work. Otherwise, you kind of get constant pushback from various sides against environmental policies, both from people who are sort of, just a bit anti-environmental policy, but also from people who genuinely, care about social policy and are worried about those impacts. And we can't not do environmental policy when you've got a climate crisis and, biodiversity crisis and all the rest of it. That's going to affect people's levels of, comfort and income across the world, in the long run. So we've got to find a way to make social policy and economic policy support environmental policy and work together with it.
Yeah, well, perhaps unpick that in a second, but just going back onto the investment thing, and this isn't a political point at all, but it, obviously it feels like with the change in government, we have had some impetus. We're starting to see things moving, and you start to get a more of a sense of certainty. And obviously the work you're doing as part of the Circular Economy Task Force, if that strategy comes out when the government have said roughly it's going to, and all the signs are it will, because you lot are pedaling at a hell of a pace. Again, there's another piece of certainty. Look, we said we delivered this strategy when at this time we have, and here's some stuff in it that starts to give you more certainty. So I think, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of historical angst for them to have to get over, and you mentioned DRS in Scotland is a classic one, but I think we're starting to get some of that certainty back, so that's good. But then you coming back to what we've just been talking about, that package, and you could argue on the one hand the work you did in the report, Susan, did review a suite of policies, but actually they're more a collection of individual policies, aren't they? They haven't been put together in a way that they bounce off each other or they're cognitive of each other. They've just been sort of, right, we've put that and we've put that and we've put that in. We think they might work together, but not necessarily. And this is where we really need this suite of policies. And like you say, not just across the resources and waste sector, but going into social policy as well.
I think it's absolutely, sorry, I'm going to come in here, but I think it's absolutely critical, because what I really like about the CIWM report is also you flag and you focus on potential unintended consequences. And I know, we in the sort of circular economy, resource and waste sector talk a lot about the plastic packaging, the plastic bag tax, which essentially achieved the objectives, the aims and objectives that it was outlined to achieve, i.e. reducing litter and consumption of single-use plastic bags. But overall, the amount of bags for life and the heavier material, we've got a greater consumption of plastic overall. But I think that demonstrates that you need what I'm going to call, you might have a policy which could, in that case, I would say that policy was also almost conceived of in isolation without thinking of those unintended consequences. Otherwise, the KPIs would have been different. But I think now, I hope there are enough of us who've worked in this policy space for a long enough time to understand that if you try and go down this route with one policy, what's the safeguard in another area? How do you set the right targets and KPIs so you're not, suddenly faced with these unintended consequences? That really overused phrase. But I think so. When you've got the suite of policies, you've got to have a scaffolding around it to make sure that those policies are actually going to deliver what you need them to deliver. I think to your point, Lee, about we've started to see some momentum. I think what's really encouraging about the current government and the way they're approaching it, okay, it can feel a bit sluggish, it can feel a bit painful, is that they, and also you've got to understand that the policymakers have had quite a number of years almost working in their siloed departments without having to give consideration as to what their colleagues across in DHSC or Department of Transport or FCDO, for instance, are doing. That there is this cross-department approach, and that's not only in the circular economy strategy. I was at an event earlier this week, an update from the Compostable Coalition, a UKRI funded programme. And I made a point around actually the opportunity for scaling up compostable packaging is not only going to come from the circular economy strategy, and how they might view compostable packaging as an opportunity within that, but also you've got to think about the other strategies that are being developed on, and I said food. So the farming roadmap, the food strategy, all plays into enabling a circular economy for, albeit a very small and specific waste stream of compostable packaging. But you've got to think about how everything joins up. And I do see that this government is really trying to think about how everything joins up. And ultimately, Treasury, who hold the purse strings, have a ministerial representative across all of these different strategies as well. So they're obviously thinking about it. It was interesting though, because again on a call yesterday with the circular economy group from the Link Coalition, a colleague in Wales was saying how it's quite interesting, or it might have been a colleague from Scotland was saying it's quite interesting that England's circular economy strategy is putting economic growth front and centre of what the strategy is looking to deliver. But actually in Scotland, and Susan, you're much closer to this than I am, given your experience at Zero Waste Scotland. In Scotland, sort of economic growth wasn't necessarily a key focus or a key driver for circular economy. Well, this was a few years ago, of course.
Yeah, interestingly, so Lee and I were both at the LARIC Scotland conference yesterday, and there were people from Scottish Government talking about the circular economy strategy that's going to be coming out in Scotland soon as well. And I did notice there was a much stronger emphasis on economic growth there. So it seems to be mimicking to some extent, or like I suppose aligning would be a more positive word, what's happening south of the border. And I suppose it's a sort of response to the never-ending cost of living crisis that we've been experiencing. So I can sort of understand that kind of way of presenting it.
But it also had authoritative nature in theirs, didn't it, from memory, which the Westminster government one doesn't have. Yeah. Which I found quite interesting.
got a paper on that, so I can share it with you. Why the circular economy is important for nature restoration.
Scottish government will be interested in that, and I suppose some of that reflects the politics, which obviously it will do. They're governments and politics, but one of the prime missions for the UK government is growth and jobs, and actually, maybe in a way that's not a bad thing, because the circles we move in and the sort of people we are, we'll focus probably more on the circular part of the circular economy. But actually, if we're really honest, if we can improve the economy part of the circular economy, it's going to happen so much quicker. So maybe classic marketing speak, don't sell the sausage, sell the sizzle. Perhaps it's the economy we should be selling, not the circular part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, there's definitely something in that. I think I've forgotten the point that I was going to make, actually, so please edit this bit out.
The positive economic case for circular business models is, in many cases is out there. I sometimes found that, I've presented evidence on it to people and they've just not really believed me. But it's like when the people I've got these stories from have been people actually working in these businesses. That obviously it doesn't work every time in every single case, but there are lots of positive stories where people have transitioned into circular economy models. Like we've got ACS in Scotland who kind of do pooling, taking back returned clothing and getting it ready for resale again, sending it back to brands, and doing very good business on the back of that. So there I think there was one down in London that I spoke to that they do office ceiling panels. So they take them back, refurbish them as part of, sort of demolition projects. So that's a situation down in London where they've got particular policies that are incentivizing this stuff to happen, that makes it a positive business model. So again, like coming back to that, you need the policy framework often in place that's going to support that to be a positive business model that works for you. So policy needs to move as well. But even without policy change, there are people making very good business models
in spite of
happen.
rather than because of. And is that where you then need the suite? So actually, if you've got, and it's not even a negative incentive perhaps, but you've got something, a policy somewhere that nudges people or starts to nudge people down a particular avenue, and then you've got the positive incentive or the funding or the subsidy aspect of a financial policy that says, and actually we can really help you make the most of that avenue we want you to take, or we can make that avenue really attractive for the next 5 years while you get a sort of a foot in the door.
I think coming back to the circular economy strategies, like I'm really interested to see different parts of the UK talking about the construction sector more, because we spent so many years just talking about packaging. And then like the construction sector obviously uses some of the most carbon intensive materials, the largest quantities of materials, by tonnage, the most waste is construction waste, right? And seeing a bit more emphasis on this is really encouraging to me. And I think it's one which is going to be probably like the top example we're going to see of needing a really big, suite of measures that work together, because it's such a massive problem to try and solve, trying to achieve circular construction without pushing up the cost of housing too much, without going against the kind of political will at the moment to try and make sure there's more housing for everyone. And one thing that's been happening, I suppose, in terms of the fiscal and financial incentives, is there's been reviews of the landfill tax, because traditionally a lot of construction waste has gone in at lower rate landfill tax. And because lower rate landfill tax has barely risen since the turn of the century, it's almost it's almost nothing really in practice. It's a few pounds per ton. And so now this question is kind of coming up of, well, actually, should we be looking at that? Should we be potentially raising the lower rate as well, a bit more significantly? Wales have taken some sort of baby steps in that direction. Scotland's been looking at it as well. There's been a consultation in England as well, I believe. But it's obviously not as simple as let's just raise the lower rate of landfill tax and the construction sector will adapt. That could cause quite severe unintended consequences, not just in terms of like disrupting the sector and everything, but also, increased waste crime and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's something that really requires extensive strategic thinking, engagement with that sector. When you're kind of looking at big construction projects, maybe big infrastructure construction projects, that sort of thing, it comes back to, issues around procurement, public procurement, like requirements around planning and the kind of waste management plans that trying to have, rather than waste management plans, having resource management plans from the start of a project, so you kind of think ahead on how you're going to manage all the materials on that project before you go into it. So we need to kind of have all these things in place. There needs to be support, around skills, financing. I mean, there's just so many different aspects to it. The technologies, the R&D that would be required. I mean, there's a lot of stuff coming up around modern methods of construction. So many promising ideas are out there. Many lower impact materials are being trialed and all that sort of thing. So there's lots of the kind of groundwork is there, but to make that all move in tandem at the right pace alongside whatever we do with the lower rate of landfill tax is something that's going to require quite a lot of people in the room to figure out, I think.
Yeah. I cast my eye very briefly. I haven't got my head around the landfill tax consultation that's just been published for England. One aim objective, or one of the points they're consulting on, is actually going to move into a flat rate of landfill tax. So that will be quite interesting once I get into the detail of that. But just coming back to construction, one of the points that we've got in our link fiscal incentives paper, and it may feel really simple and just so binary, but I mean, the perversity of the fact that for new build construction, there's a zero VAT rate, but for refurbishment and renovation, there's a full VAT rate. So actually, what would you do if you simply flip that on its head?
Yeah.
Would you suddenly see businesses making more of an effort to see how they could repurpose the materials if there is demolition involved, or work within, obviously as long as it's sound and health and safety, etc., considerations are factored in, work within an existing, building shell or structure, and move that way. I mean, I would love to. I know I probably won't ever get an opportunity, but I would love to see the thinking that's gone behind the really iconic conversation of the massive Marks and Spencers. Other retailers are available. The beautiful, iconic Marks and Spencers building on Oxford Street, which has had this wrangle over, they want to redevelop it. They're saying it's not fit for purpose. They need to sort of update it to bring it into the modern age. But the decision has been granted to demolish the whole building and build something from new. That is a beautiful building, and I don't think structurally there's anything necessarily wrong with it, but because of old wiring or the way it's configured, I guess the case has been made it's too challenging to refurb and renovate it. So therefore, and I would imagine part of the too challenging is also it's too expensive because we've got to pay 20% VAT. Whereas if we pull the whole thing down and build it up, we don't have to pay that. Someone show me the numbers and tell me that hasn't been a factor in that decision. I might be completely talking nonsense. But I remember what I was going to say earlier around, Susan, you made a point about how sort of circular economy policies aren't as advanced as, say, for instance, the approach to net zero. And one thing that came to my mind is that, when we talk about net zero, we talk about obviously mitigation, which I would include in that sort of carbon capture and storage and the new technologies that are coming through, which everyone gets overexcited about. But also there's adaptation. And adaptation is really important, I think. And it reminded me of a project that I've been involved with, again, funded by UK Research and Innovation, which is around looking at existing, and sorry, it's about packaging, but looking at existing packaging supply chain systems within the UK, and so the infrastructure that exists for those, and how that infrastructure can be adapted to support the scaling up of reuse systems. So that I think is really interesting too, because we're talking about adaptation there. I think people get scared when they think that you have to tear it down and build it all up again. We've got such an embedded legacy system going on around us. So actually thinking about how that can be adapted and how existing systems can be used but adapted slightly. And then as part of that project as well, there's a whole load of really clever modelling by the team behind it, the Unpackaged actually are behind it, looking at the different costs of the different adaptations that would be needed by the different stakeholders involved, and it looks right through from the packaging, the producers themselves, through to the retailers, local authorities, consumers, waste managers, etc. So that's going to be a really interesting project. The draft report is actually in my inbox to review, and it's going to be launched really soon. But I think that's a really interesting, and it may be that the fiscal incentives for adaptation, or the financing need for adaptation, is actually more palatable for financial institutions than starting directly from scratch on brand new systems which you don't know are going to work or not. So the financial risk is bigger. Whereas if you can adapt with existing equipment, existing systems, whether it's technology systems, then it makes it a slightly different, potentially a slightly less risky proposal.
Yeah, and
completely making obsolete the existing system. You're trying to work within it.
And then there's probably sort of corporate social responsibility, I'll say rewards within that as well, that companies could tag into. And it, for me, it raises this thing. We're never starting with a blank sheet of paper, are we? And I'm speaking in terms of actual policy, let alone buildings and everything.
And actually, sorry, a point I wanted to make is if we were starting with a blank piece of paper, we would not be designing the systems that we've got as they are now.
Exactly, and that is part of the difficulty we have. We've got all these policies, it's a bit like London, we've got all these policies layered on top of each other, and it does become slightly difficult to untangle some of them sometimes. So again, like you mentioned the landfill tax there, the proposal does seem quite stark. We're gonna put it up there, but actually, because we've already got it and we've had it in there for so long, we may need to make that massive jump in order to rectify things a little bit.
But the unintended consequences if we push it up too much too quickly. I mean, we already heard, like you're doing sort of anonymous interviews recently, how because you can put fines in, construction fines quite easily, and at lower rate landfill tax, that some operators are deliberately just grinding stuff up. So they can put it in with less questioning, and that so actually you end up making things less available to the circular economy because of trying to do something that's supposed to help it.
That's exactly. And you've always got to mitigate against that. Again, I mentioned the stopping of the pre-consumer plastics, but you could end up with Smith will take their pre-consumer to Jones's, who will take theirs to Davis's, who will take theirs back to Smith, and now it's post-consumer. So we're starting to move plastic around that wasn't getting moved around before, and it's still getting recycled, but now you can count it. So there's always going to be things like that in policy, I guess, that you've got to try and mitigate as best you can.
I really admire people who have brains that can work like that, around something in such a kind of cynical way. I really do have an admiration for that. Sometimes I wish I could be a bit more like that.
It's just a different way of being solution focused.
Solutions focused.
I mean, it feels like we've only just scratched the surface, but then we've been going at this for so long and covered so much ground already. We're probably at a point where we're going to sort of have to wrap it up there, which and I always say this, maybe I'm just getting too into these podcasts, but I'm always saying, we could have gone off here and done another podcast on that. But genuinely, we could have done there, and there's stuff we haven't touched on. So I'm lining up all these other podcasts for the content team, that they won't need to go out and find any new subjects. We'll just be doing continuations of the stuff we've done. But I mean, Susan and Paula, that's been really interesting from my point of view, and it's definitely got me thinking again. I mean, thank you both for taking us through that. Any one brief final thought? I mean, is there a sort of a financial policy out there at the moment that you think, yeah, that's the one we could really do with bringing in, be it really high level or really detailed and niche, it doesn't matter.
You want to go first, Paula?
I know you trailed this question for us, Lee, and I like literally, it's so difficult because I think what we've talked around today exemplifies the fact that there is no single policy that is going to do it all. I mean, I think if for instance, I just took one aspect of the three kind of, producers, financial investors and consumers, if we're thinking of those as sort of people, stakeholders within the whole, that we need to engage with circular economy. I mean, despite the fact that there have been unintended consequences arising from it, and on the basis that we would learn from it, I still do think that the plastic bag tax was so simple and so low. What was it? 5p?
5p?
5p. And all of a sudden, that 5p was like the biggest deal in the world. I mean, now I'm so ingrained in I need to take my bags. But I remember when it first came in, I would forget my bags. I would literally have my pockets stuffed with things that I needed in order to avoid that 5p charge. So the psychology of that, I think, is fascinating. Okay, notwithstanding the unintended consequences that have arisen from that, but that was so simple, and it was only 5p, but it made people change their behaviour.
Cool.
And what drove down single-use plastic bag consumption by 95% or something.
Exactly.
There's something to be said for that. Just didn't have the right KPIs in place.
Yeah, cool. Anything from you, Susan? You feel that could really do with being brought in one way, shape, or form?
I'm tired of the packaging policies going on and on and on for so long. So I want them sort of resolved, obviously, like everyone else does. But I'm going to point to the the WEEE policies. That it would be really nice to see that coming back soon. The proposals around WEEE EPR, but not just kind of as originally put out, but with much more emphasis on reuse, because there's a massive difference between packaging, which used packaging, there's really just not much of a reuse sort of story there. It's got to happen upstream for but with electricals, it's that there is a huge opportunity. Like, I've been out to visit the facilities at Irvine, Optimum Eco, that's southwest Scotland, where they do a lot of small WEEE and computers and TV screens and all this kind of stuff. And there's the people there see real potential to get a lot more stuff diverted for reuse, not just for recycling, but also to increase the quality of recycling as well. But to get that right, the WEEE EPR scheme needs to actually have these much more nuanced and specific targets. Like they have to have a target for reuse. They have to have a target that's designed to encourage sort of ongoing improvements in the quality of recycling, like the kind of recycling outcomes, not just kind of what's the headline figure of what is sent off for recycling, irrespective of what happens to it after it's sent off.
Because just what's collected.
Yeah, exactly. Because actually, once you're collecting, it's one thing, but then keeping it dry, not smashing it up, during transportation, delivering it to someone who can then process it, test it, whether it can be reused, repaired, all the rest of it. It's like the whole system has to support that. At the moment, it's not built in with the kind of EPR rules, the limited producer responsibility system that we've got at the moment. There's just not enough incentive around that. It's like, from the producer's perspective, it's just as long as you sent it off and it's been ticked a box that's going for recycling, whatever happens to it at the end, you're actually not responsible for. But the environmental benefits of reuse over recycling, and of high quality recycling over low quality recycling, there's data around that. It's well documented. So it just seems completely common sense to me that we need to get that built into policy, and especially if we're now already talking about what other sectors are we going to apply EPR to. Well, let's get this right for this material, and also recognize that for every next type of product or material that we're going to do this for, they're going to be different too, and we're going to have to like really design that carefully and not just kind of copy and paste a system from one sector to another. So that's a bit of a long-winded way of saying I want EPR but done right, please.
And we would just add, obviously, because we did a report on it, as part of that, you stick a deposit on batteries and things containing batteries, because you've got the evidence there that supports that.
Yeah.
And then just to emphasize that it's not all about fiscal and financial policies. Very much support the ban on single-use vapes. As the parent of 2 teenagers, I'd probably quite like to just see like all vapes banned. But
again,
they're kind of
another podcast.
But why do we have single-use batteries? Forget vapes for a moment. Why have we got so many single-use batteries at all? So there are some areas where we just need to go with like eco-design. We need to regulate to actually get rid of some things that we just don't want out there. Setting recycling facilities on fire. Thanks very much.
Well, I think in the spirit of what we've talked about, I think, Susan, you mentioned it there, the eco-design. You can't have the kind of enabling of recovery and recycling of items if they haven't been designed for recycling or repair or refurbishment. So there's that. Am I allowed to do a little plug? You can take it out if you want.
Go on then. I'll let you. I'll let you, but only because I'm going to do one after you've done yours.
Just on the point of I yesterday WWF kindly sponsored, I suppose, by our corporate partnership with a major high street mobile phone retailer that I won't mention on here. I've launched a report called Fast Phones, which is looking specifically at the environmental impacts of our phones from production and the critical raw materials and the rare earth metals and stuff. But also it's got, I think, probably first of its kind consumer research to try and understand consumers and their understanding of the impacts of their mobile phones on the environment and on emissions, but also where their thinking is as to what are the sorts of incentives that might encourage them to shift their behaviour around their mobile phone consumption. So Fast Phones, look it up on the WWF website. Thank you very much.
I think that's also a bit of a plug for Resource Futures, so thank you for that.
A plug for Resource Futures.
Let's have a little plug loving then, because you mentioned ACS, and also we mentioned earlier on about selling the sizzle, as it were, and there's a couple of things that will be coming up at the Festival of Circular Economy that's happening at the end of this month. So ACS are talking at that. We've got a roundtable on language around the circular economy going on. So for anyone listening who hasn't had a look at the Festival of Circular Economy, stick that in your search engine. That'll come up. 2 days online, day in person. So there you go. We've rounded it up all with a little bit of plugging, which is not a bad thing. So
you need to invite my tennis coach to be part of that round table about language on circular economy.
Absolutely, yeah. Susan, Paula, thank you very much both. It's been really interesting and engaging and intriguing all at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
Cool. And if anyone else wants to find out about anything else related to CIWM that we haven't already plugged, then head across to our website. Also, given the fact we've been talking about circular economy, the Circular Economy Institute, which is owned by the Chartered Institution of Waste Management. But until then, we'll see you next time on the Beyond Waste podcast.